Good morning and welcome to Adult Ed at First Pres Church, River Forest, Illinois. And wherever you are, we're in the Maxwell room with great technology. Thank you, Julia. And for those of you who are joining online, welcome to you. This is the second of 3 sessions on the Protestant Reformation, and today we're going to look much more closely at the lives and accomplishments of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and John Knox, arranged alphabetically and chronologically. So here we go. Why did Luther study in the field of law? He received his bachelor's degree in liberal arts before turning 21, and then 3 years later he got his MA degree, concentrating in scholasticism, philosophical and theological thinkers of the Middle Ages. St. Anselm of Canterbury, St. William of Ockham, St. Bonaventure, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Dry, very slow going, and I know because I had a dissertation director who said, let's have a little Latin study group, and we're going to read Aquinas in Latin for a whole year. Fortunately, it was on a grant, so I wasn't paying the tuition. After his master's degree, Luther was eligible for one of the 3 higher disciplines in medieval studies, medieval universities: law, medicine, or theology. His father, Hans, chose for him, and he chose law. Why? Because it was a lucrative and rewarding profession. So Luther went out and he bought the Corpus Juris Canonici, the corpus of canon law, meaning Roman Catholic, the entire book of Roman Catholic law, and a collection of ecclesiastical law texts and other important legal books. And less than 6 weeks later, an event happened that caused him to enter the monastery in Erfurt, Germany, the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine, a mendicant order, meaning that they were dependent on others for finances, housing, food, and they didn't beg, people donated money, but they gave up all of their possessions. What happened was that Luther was between towns and a violent thunderstorm broke out. And it terrified him, and he made a vow that if God saved his life, he would become a monk. So law school for 6 weeks and then right into the monastery. After he made that vow, he prayed to Saint Anne, the patron saint of miners. And that was his father's original vocation, and Hans moved up the promotion ladder and ended up owning a copper mine. So he was a man of means. And Luther, being a good Catholic at the time, of course, prayed to the appropriate saint, and he was saved. So he told his young father that he was besieged by terror and the agony of salvation. And he wasn't sure that he was going to be saved, and he thought that he was going to have a sudden death. And his father's response to those words: may it not prove an illusion and deception. So in 1507, Martin Luther, 24 years old, is ordained and he celebrates his first Mass. 1512, he becomes a PhD and receives his doctorate from the University of Wittenberg, and he assumed the professorship in biblical studies sponsored by the Augustinian order, meaning that they placed one of their own people in there and also paid his salary. We would call that an endowed chair in modern academic terminology. At the same time, his administrative duties in the order and the monastery increased. He offered 2 courses on the Psalms and classes on St. Paul's epistles to the Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. And when I think of him teaching, my seminary professors all retired. Some of them have passed away in the courses that I took on Paul. One student reported that Martin was a man of middle stature with a voice that combined sharpness in the enunciation of syllables and words and softness in tone. He spoke neither too quickly nor too slowly, but at an even pace without hesitation and very clearly. It's a nice endorsement from a student. Now, indulgences, the hammer, and the document, and Schlosskirche. I'm throwing a little German just because I had to learn it in graduate school and then again in seminary, reading some things in original German with great difficulty. The hammer makes for a dramatic image, Luther nailing those theses to the cathedral door at Wittenberg, and we all know about that from October 31st, 1517. And there's some nifty art, but there's no verification that he ever did this. He never wrote about it, and the first mention of it in print using the hammer was after his death. But the document is real. So I'm going to read from Thesis 86, a question he raises. Why does not the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, we'll get to that, build the Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers? Crassus was a wealthy Roman general turned politician, and he formed a triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey to challenge the Roman Senate. His wealth came from the sale of confiscated property, allowing him to extend credit to senators, who then and today don't really receive much of a salary for the work that they have to do. Maybe he was an early lobbyist of sorts. And as for the indulgences, they were real. In northern Germany, a Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, was credited with just going out on the street and kind of hawking indulgences for sale. And they were for the living and the dead. So for those of us with family members of another generation, we could get them out of purgatory by giving money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which is in a state of terrible disrepair. And it's translated from the German, but Tetzel wrote this little ditty. When a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. The princes got most of the money and the Pope got most of the blame. Not much money went to St. Peter's. It was to the ruling powers in Germany. And the system of indulgences, the technical word is a plenary indulgent. We have a plenum air return system of ducts in the building and in any building, and it means full. All of the air is moved. So plenary indulgence means forgiveness of sins past, present, and future. Just a minute, I want to get that. A get out of jail free card. The doctrine of purgatory is no longer part of Catholic teaching. Same thing with not eating meat on Friday. That's not a requirement anymore. So theology does change. And Schlosskirche is castle church in German. And for Roman Catholics in Chicago, that place here, we don't have a castle in Chicago that I know of. Well, there is a Lockwood Castle, used to be the name of it in Edgebrook, that is an ice cream parlor and has a kind of medieval theme. And there's a Binny's liquor store on Lincoln or Clark, somewhere south of Belmont, that's built like a castle, but they're not real ones. Holy Name is where my friend and one-time pastoral neighbor, the very Reverend Greg Sakowitz, is currently rector. And if you want to see a lively preacher, just Google Holy Name. I looked at his message for the fourth Sunday in Lent. And he's good. He's a very good preacher. So the Archbishop of Mainz complains to Rome about Luther, and that really gets things going. There was a disputation, a theological argument, a debate at Leipzig, and Eck's early treatises, Johann Eck, drew a lot of attention, and one of the first prior to this was entitled, was focusing on the medieval prohibition against charging interest on money. And he attacked the prohibition, felt that it was fine to charge interest on money. So Luther is given an order to recant, and instead of doing that, he denies the supremacy of the Pope and the infallibility, not of the Pope, but of general councils. It's important to know that papal infallibility didn't enter Roman Catholic doctrine until the 19th century. We all presume that it was just the very early church, but it was a very late development. This is the infallibility of general councils. So Eck was friendly with Luther up until 1517. And within months, he labeled the 95 Theses as heretical. Imagine that. And he was also a prolific writer in Latin, Eck, and he composed a lot of defenses of the Roman Catholic faith. He has a treatise entitled Handbook Against the Lutherans, written in 1525, and it went through 91 editions before 1600. It was the best known Catholic work of the before 1600. Think of the Reformation as an early version of scholarly arguments in print, in any subject, where people debate back and forth in print, or a debate, not in the presidential primaries, but among theologians. Eck also produced a German translation of the Bible in 1537 for Roman Catholics, and it was not very popular. So Pope Leo X decides that he's got to get serious about this. He threatens excommunication. He sends a papal bull, the document with a seal on it, and Luther has 60 days to make a decision. So what he does is spend his 60 days writing. He's a seminary professor and a scholar. And at the end of the 60 days, he burns two things: the papal bull and the Roman Catholic Book of Canon Law, one of his textbooks when he was in law school for 6 weeks. And he burns them. The opening of that bull is, the bull is entitled Exsurge Domine, Arise, O Lord. And last week, Dr. talked about the wild boar. That was Luther. And the Pope was away at a prince's lodge hunting. Guess what he was hunting in Italy? Wild boar. So it all came together when he was writing, and Eck helped him prepare this papal bull. He condemned 41 of Luther's theses. I did the math, and that's 43%. By today's college standards, Luther flunked with a grade of 57. And he obviously was a better student than that. Finally, the Pope commissioned Eck to publish and enforce the new bull throughout Germany. Now, in German, it's the Reichstag, and we know that from World War II history, the government building in what was East Berlin. And it literally means parliament. And if we parse that word, it comes from Old French to Middle English to Modern English, and it means speaking until we achieve some result or goal or action. And for Presbyterians, this means session. The purpose is to come together, discuss, decide, and have a result or an action. And that's what was meant to happen at the Diet of Worms. Diet's another odd medieval theological word. So there's a peasants' revolt that is motivated by the writings of Luther and other reformers after the Edict of Worms. And then in 1525, Luther marries Katharina von Bora. And she is such a brilliant woman, and we'll get to more of that, that his students call her Dr. Katie. Let me back up because I want to leave that bottom down there. She was sent, this is about Katie Luther, which I guess I get to call her that because I'm Lutheran by education. She was sent to a Benedictine cloister by her father in 1504. She was 5 then, and this was a not uncommon practice for people of means, because that's where you got an education. We didn't have public schools. And when we get to John Knox, we'll see that that's something he wanted to start in Scotland during the Reformation. It got voted down, unfortunately. So after 19 years of religious life, she's pretty much attuned to what's going on in the air and in pamphlets and in speeches about the Reformation. And she grew dissatisfied with convent life. She conspired with several other nuns to leave, and she contacted, guess who, for assistance? Martin Luther. So on Easter Eve, of all times, Luther sent a city councilman who was also a merchant. He regularly delivered barrels of herring to the convent. The nuns escaped by hiding in this man's covered wagon, surrounded by barrels of fish. And a local student wrote to a friend about this, I quote, "A wagon load of Vestal virgins has just come to town, all more eager for marriage than for life. God grant them husbands, lest worst befall." It was a long time ago. Okay, I'm wincing because my daughters and my wife are not like this. But can you imagine the scandal when the word got out about this? So within 2 years after these women leave the convent, Luther becomes a real estate broker, a yenta, and a recruiter, a one-man employment agency. Let me explain. Eventually, he placed the nuns in homes, marriages, or jobs, except for Katharina. She had just a long list of suitors, very prominent people, including other pastors. And then she told Luther's friend and another reformer, Nicholas von Amsdorf, that she would be willing to marry only Luther or von Amsdorf himself. I don't know who proposed or how it happened, but she ended up with Luther. And a lot of his friends were unsure of whether he should even be married, because this was another slap in the face of the Roman Catholic Church and the doctrine of celibacy. Go ahead.
Did you mention how many nuns there were that took off?
It was under 10.
Yeah, and they had to fit in a wagon, right?
Yeah, with barrels of herring.
Right.
And that was significant,
Oh, yeah.
you know, given the turmoil that had started with the Reformation. So the bachelor Luther eventually concluded, and I quote, that his marriage would please his father, rile the Pope, cause the angels to laugh and the devils to weep. The former priest and former nun married on June 13th, 1525. She was 26 years old and he was 41, and they resided in the Augusteum, translates as the Black Cloister, so described because the robes of the residents. It was a former dormitory for the Augustinian friars studying in Wittenberg, and this was a wedding gift by the reform-minded Elector of Saxony. Elector not like the Electoral College, but a person appointed to a position of power underneath the prince. And he was the brother of Luther's protector, Frederick III. who whisked him off to a castle in hiding. And even Frederick's own brother didn't know that Luther was in hiding, fearing death at the hands of the Pope's troops. So he hid at Wartburg Castle, and then during the Peasants' War, parts of Wittenberg University were abandoned. So in 1524, when Luther comes back from the Wartburg Castle, he's given the empty residence halls as a place for the Luther family, where he lived until his death in 1546. And it was here that he held table talks. There are several volumes of these, and no, I'm not ready for that yet, where he invited students to his home, and I'll say more about that. He also wrote throughout his time there, including his monumental translation of the Bible with revisions. And he also expanded, building onto the Luther House, which it was called, and he built a Catharinian portal, a carved entryway that was a birthday present for his wife. Now, Katie went to work managing the holdings of the monastery. They bred and sold cattle. They had a brewery to sell beer and also provide it for the family, and prior to that, the monks. And then the steady stream of students, some of whom boarded with the Luthers in this former residence, and visitors who were seeking audiences with Martin. And when there was widespread illness, she opened a hospital on the farm, ministering to the sick along with other nurses. Luther called her the boss of Zoldorf, named after the farm they owned, and the Morning Star of Wittenberg for her habit of rising at 4 a.m. to start her workday. And he also called her my Lord Katie. However we might interpret those words, they demonstrate that she really had a high degree of control over her own life and decisions. And it's important for me, again, because of my wife and daughters, to claim that she wasn't just following her husband's orders, she carved out her own path. He said about Katie, "You convince me of whatever you please. You have complete control. I concede to you," very generous of him, "the control of the household. You take care of all the domestic stuff. I've got important stuff to do." And he said, "Providing my rights are preserved." So it strikes me as an interesting balance. And then he made the statement, "If I can endure conflict with the devil, sin, and a bad conscience, then I can put up with the irritation of Katie von Bora." And finally, he said, "I shall die as one who loves and lauds marriage." Beautiful statement. So Luther continues being Luther, doing his thing. His wife births 6 children, runs the family business, and dies in December of 1552, Luther having preceded her by 6 years. So what else did Luther do? Well, he translated the Bible into German. He used the Greek New Testament written by a Dutch humanist named Erasmus, who was one of the most powerful forces from a secular point of view in the Reformation. And Erasmus himself was really a highly ethical person, but he was focusing on recapturing Greek knowledge and providing translations for people in teaching Greek and recapturing classical philosophy and literature, not anti-religious. So Luther used his translation of the Greek New Testament and in 11 weeks translated it.
Wow.
11 weeks, just an incredible accomplishment. I took a crash course in Greek for 8 weeks in the summer. And I thought, well, okay, this is a good beginning. And then I took 2 whole years. So I felt like I could use it. And Hebrew, only 1 quarter was required. The biblical vocabulary is so small, it's about 5,600 words. I thought once I learned the alphabet and could read it, I just have to memorize vocabulary. So I took Hebrew for 2 years. And I'm glad I did. Fortunately, I have an aptitude for languages. Thank you, God. Das Neue Testament Deutsche was published in 1522, and it contained woodcuts from one of the best artists and involved in printing at the time, Lucas Cranach. And some of you may know Albrecht Dürer, a medieval art, Reformation artist. He did a series of prints on the apocalypse, and those were put into the Bible. So it was a book ahead of its time, a translation with illustrations. And it sold approximately 5,000 copies in the first 2 months of its release. He not only wrote on seemingly disparate topics, theology and politics, but he brought them together and he made claims about how they could coexist for the good of people and of the nations. And we moderns talk about separation of church and state. Separate topic, but I'll just throw out that we have it when we want it, but we really don't have it. We really don't have it. They overlap per force, just because of modern developments. But they can't be separated, but we can put up some boundaries, but there's always crossing over. When Luther did this, he was often not very subtle. I do describe him as a crabby, frowning, grumpy old German. And that's only one side of him. If you read the table talks, you'll see why. A student asked him once, "Blessed Martin, if you knew the world were going to end tomorrow, what would you do?" His answer, "Plant a tree." And so whimsical and so full of faith that, that's his other side. So he studied and valued music, and he composed hymns. He influenced Bach and another composer, lesser known, Buxtehude. So I'm going to play the great Reformation hymn that is sung in most mainline Protestant churches on Reformation Sunday.
What's that a picture of?
A mighty fortress. Not a particular one, but a good question, just to give us the idea. And this is for people who love music. There's a website called hymnary.org, and it has a heading called Tune Information. I looked it up. The first line paraphrases the opening line of Psalm 46, and this is from the NRSV. It's got a subtitle for the Psalms, and the subtitle is God's Defense of His City and People. And here's the first verse. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And it has instructions, and this is for Jane Holstein and all the other organists who play on Reformation Sunday, and singers and people in church. Be sure to play at a moderately fast pace and keep the rhythm crisp. This tune must sparkle with energy. Use brass for festive services. Where's the trombone and French horn and trumpet players who should have had them this morning with the horns? He invited seminary students. And that's how we got the table talks. Beer, good German beer. Brötchen, and if you've been to Germany, those are the hard, crusty rolls that you get at breakfast that are very soft inside. And Käse, cheese, and Gespräch, speaking, conversation. In today's parlance, we call this pub theology, and it's very real. I have a very dear friend who became a friend. He visited Martin Luther Church, which was my first call in Chicago. And after the service, he talked with me and wanted to come in and talk more. So he came in after work, and I went over to the office in the early evening, and he wanted to talk about baptisms because he'd never been baptized. And he had a lot of really thoughtful questions. So I said, we can meet and I'll answer all of your questions because we've run out of time. And he said, Pastor, is it okay? Do you drink beer? And I said, yes. And he said, well, could we go out for a beer and a sandwich and talk theology? Yes, yes. And we did 4 or 5 times, and then I baptized him. And it's a real gift for clergy to be able to. Any baptism is a gift, but there's something very different about adults who make that decision instead of parents making it for infants. They're all wonderful, but this was very, very special. So I'm a liberal believer in pub theology. I already talked about Katie and that system, but here's Luther's core legacy. Faith in Jesus, not good works, brings salvation. 2, the Bible is the final source of truth about God, not a church, not the priests. And 3, the church is made up of all believers, not just the clergy. And some Protestant churches have the title, the pastor and the pastor's name, and then it says ministers. And it says all the people of whatever Protestant church, which is the way it's supposed to be. And then the 3 solas in Latin. Sola gives us solitary. It means standing on its own, alone. Faith, scripture, and grace. And satis in Latin gives us satisfied when we're made complete, our tummies are full, or we're so happy we're going to burst and we can't get any happier. Satis est, it's enough. We don't need anything else. And that really, that's kind of the rallying cry of the Reformation. Now, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm going to try to get through John Calvin. Like Luther, whose father went from copper miner to owner, Calvin had a father who had become wealthy and connected. So you'll see a lot of parallel events. He gets an important job working as a secretary to the bishop when he's 12 years old, the same year that Luther was communicated. He goes and studies law and philosophy. Then he moves to 2 other universities where he's exposed to humanism. Remember Erasmus, who translated the Greek New Testament? He studies Greek art, theology, and Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Calvin's father demands that he finishes the law degree. How many of us have paid for children in college? Does that give us rights?
No.
Some, but I can remember times when my kids reached a certain age and point and said, Dad, this is my business. And I wanted to say, yeah, but it's my checkbook. And I thought, no, they have to make their own decisions. And that's part of growing as a parent and part of children claiming adulthood. He complies, he finishes law studies, and then he publishes his first book, a commentary on a writing by a Roman philosopher. Again, unless you love the Middle Ages, this is dry writing. Now, one of Calvin's friends, director of the college, gives a speech in Geneva, and this stirs up a lot of anger because of the conflict that the Protestant reformers are creating with the Catholic Church. So he flees. Calvin receives an indictment from the city government of Geneva, and he goes to Basel. And then this is about Calvin's conversion. This is what he wrote. O God, thou keepest me bowed down as if thy bolts were falling on my head, thunderbolts. I condemn with tears my past manner of life and transfer myself to thine. Poor and wretched, I throw myself on the mercy which thou hast shown us in Jesus Christ. I enter that only harbor of salvation. O God, reckon not up against me that terrible desertion and disgust of thy word, from which thy marvelous bounty has rescued me. Now that's antiquated language, but for me, it becomes so real and alive and powerful. And it's so Reformation, and so especially Calvin. A good friend of mine, speaking of Luther, because of a few things he wrote, calls it worm theology. You're lower than a worm. Nothing that I know of can get lower than a worm unless it's really underground. And there is an element of that, but there's also transformation. So we have in 1534 placards being put up on 2 successive evenings in Paris and in 4 major provincial cities. And one of the posters was put up on the bedchamber door of King Francis I. Little breach of security there, him shook up. And yet he protected the Protestants from the extreme measures that the Parliament of Paris wanted to enforce. And he honored a request for leniency that was made by one of Luther's closest friends. Calvin publishes the Institute of the Christian Religions, which all good Presbyterian and Reformed pastors read. I don't want to call it dry because it's important, but it's thick and it's full of legal terminology and philosophical and theological terminology, but it is the document, especially for Presbyterians. So he's going to Strasbourg to work with a follower of Luther, Martin Bucer, and on his way there's a war that causes him to go through Geneva. He makes a really lively guy, a very strong, forceful personality, Guillaume Farel, and he becomes a lecturer and a reader in the church and then a pastor. These two support Lutheran principles, and we have a group called the iconoclasts, a Greek icon. They wanted no pictures, no statues, no art. So they pulled down the statues and put the art in storage or destroyed it or sold it. Just a plain, simple church without all of this decoration. Well, the Council of Geneva, a big one, 200 members, I can't imagine a session of that size, banishes them. They give them 3 days to leave town. So it's to Strasbourg, and there he writes his commentary, and I love this title, The Little Treatise on Holy Communion. And he becomes familiar with local songs. And he writes a small book called Some Psalms and Canticles Put into Song. And then he marries the widow of an Anabaptist. The Anabaptists at the time did not believe in infant baptism. And they baptized only adults, and their descendants are some of the modern Baptists and the Mennonites. And their core belief was adult baptism. The rest of their beliefs are not different, although if you know any Mennonites, peace is one of theirs. They're conscientious objectors. When I was a lay missionary in Thailand, I met a Mennonite couple who had come there from Vietnam, and they stayed 4 years during the Vietnam War, ministering to people in the villages, caring for them. And their goal is not so much conversion as to live out their faith by being present. I admire that. And practices have changed. So in our era, the age varies. So Calvin returns to Geneva and he stays there over 20 years.
So were they meeting in Catholic churches at this point, or were they just meeting in house churches, or was there a, kind of a religion that was Lutheranism or whatever, and they were meeting separate from the other Catholics?
I can only speak to the Lutheran tradition because that's the one I know best because I taught Lutheran church history in the seminary as an adjunct. For instance, they were meeting at the Luther House, H-A-U-S in German, the former cloister, which the prince gave to Luther and Katie. And the Catholic churches stayed Catholic. Luther never intended to start a religion. It got named after him, and we could just as easily have Calvin instead of Presbyterian because he really did found what becomes modern day Presbyterian. And Knox took a different spin on it. It was much more austere and rigid than Calvin. And we'll get to that later with Knox. So it was mostly separate from, but eventually they had their own buildings. And that was just part of the gradual movement. And then Calvin publishes this fancy title, Tigurinus is the Latin name for Geneva. And there were lots of arguments about communion. Is it really the body and blood of Christ? If you're Roman Catholic, the doctrine of transubstantiation, which comes from Greek philosophy, the essence remains the same, but the substance changes. It's philosophical, it's not theological. And Luther got around this. He said, Christ is in, with, and under the sacrament. So when I taught confirmation, the first year, one of the students said, well, what does that mean? And I couldn't explain it. It's a clever way of getting around a theological argument. I said, well, come on, let's go up around the altar where communion happens. And the kids were all looking around, and I started looking with them, and I said, is Christ in there? Is underneath there? No, it's a matter of proclamation, the body of Christ given for you, the blood of Christ shed for you, whatever words we use, the cup of salvation, and a matter of faith. And that's a mystery I'll live with because it's the most important sacrament for me to receive. And Calvin pulls people together. In 1559, he's finally made a citizen of Geneva. And then malaria and other complications cause his death. Now, I've got 5 more minutes, so I'm going to finish Calvin.
You can stay until 10.
Oh, I do?
10:15 service.
Oh, good. Okay. He settled differences within this new movement of Protestantism. He was somebody who could bring people together. He attempted to make Geneva a model city of God. Now, in this, he was profoundly influenced by Saint Augustine, the early father of the church. Augustine wrote a philosophical treatise to rebut pagan claims that the sack of Rome, which happened in 410 when barbarians overran Rome, was one of the consequences for Christianity abolishing pagan worship instead of letting it continue. It has the marvelous title of De Civitate Dei contra Paganos, concerning the city of God against the pagans. So, and he also wrote a book called The City of God. And that is a masterpiece of Western culture. Also, if you want to have some interesting reading, look at Augustine's Confessions. At a used bookstore, I found them in a little small stained leather edition for about $10. And he had an interesting and somewhat colorful life. I'm choosing my words carefully. Before, as an adult, he heard a sermon over a wall outside of the church, and his mother was Christian, and he decided to convert on the spot. But up until that point, he lived rather fully and freely. So I recommend the book. Now, he wanted Geneva to be a model city. He started an academy there, which became one of the most well-known schools in Europe of the time. And Lutherans visit Germany. Presbyterians have a choice, Geneva or Edinburgh. And if I had to choose, I couldn't. Both for me. Well, really all three. And he systematized and then reapplied all of the ideas of the first generation of reformers. And systematics, a little side note, is a discipline in theology. Some seminaries require a year of coursework in systematic theology. When I started it, I said to my teacher for the first course, this is an oxymoron. Theology is not systematic. And he didn't look at me in anything other than a kind of playful way. And he said, just wait and bring that up after the first course, okay? And I learned a great deal, starting with the early creeds, and then at the end of the year, we read 20th century giants, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, and the Niebuhr brothers, H. Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr. One of them president of Elmhurst College. The other pastored in the inner city by choice, German refugees. And these are people worth reading, so I'm very glad for this. Now, I'm going to keep going because
Terry, when you talk about the first generation of reformers, you're talking about Martin Luther. Do you include Huss in there?
yes,
Okay.
and he was Czech, help me.
Yes, Czech.
Yeah,
He was prior to Calvin, but prior to I was just in the Czech Republic, so we did a little bit in the Hussite Wars.
okay,
But they didn't have the printing press. I think that was the thing you mentioned yesterday that made me realize what the difference was, is it was all word of mouth, and so it was much harder, I think. And I think that's what made one of the big differences for Luther, right,
Yeah.
to start this.
yes, absolutely. And there are a lot, I'm glad you brought that up, Lynn. There are a lot of misconceptions about that. The early printing was done on, some of us are old enough to know about typesetting. There used to be a column in the Tribune called Linotype. And typesetting are little lead pieces. Remember manual typewriters?
Yeah.
It's like the letter set in trays. That's where we get uppercase and lowercase instead of capital and small letters. The capital letters were kept in one case, and they weren't organized alphabetically. It was by the frequency of the letters. So I would type out a page for a flyer, and a typesetter would do this and put it in a tray, and then a printing press, hydraulic or electric, would do this with paper and ink, and boop, 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 and out comes, it was the precursor to photocopy machines. Which I don't understand the technology, except that as long as there's an ink cartridge, it works when I hit the button. And all books were done on wood letters in the monasteries. So they had scribes, they even had a Latin title, amanuensis, manual. With their hands, they copied manuscripts. Yes.
Back in ancient times, when I was in grammar school, we literally had a typesetting, the guys had manual arts, which part of it was typesetting. We had to learn how to do that.
They didn't have that in my high school, and I'm sorry. I never knew at the time when I was gonna end up.
And that was grammar
teaching.
school.
Grammar school,
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Now, predestination and election. Would you like to go out for lunch and discuss this for 2 hours? It's tricky doctrine, and I decided to include it, and then say, if you really want to talk about this more, I'll give you my email address and we can set up a meeting somewhere. But it's too lengthy to really cover here, but it's important. And it's the doctrine that God has eternally chosen those whom God intends to save. Okay? And that means from the beginning of time, when God created, God knew who God was going to save or intended to save. Now, the problem comes in here that Luther believes so strongly in grace. How could God, a God of love and grace, say, this group is predestined? Then you get double predestination, which is really fallen into disfavor. But that says this group is saved, that group is not. And this is all in God's plan from the beginning. I have a headache just even talking about it, seriously. And in modern day usage, philosophers have thrown out, come up with the idea of determinism, which is scientific as well as philosophical, and fatalism, which is more of a mindset. We're all probably doomed, so let's just get on with life and try to put that in the background. Then we throw in the human moral will, that we can make choices. And predestination is really based on emphasizing Paul and the New Testament idea of the divine plan of salvation. And Paul is a helpful background. Election comes from the Greek word, they are called electos, the chosen ones. And there are a whole bunch of biblical references, and Romans 8:33 says, who will bring a charge against God's elect? And Paul's asking a rhetorical question there. The answer is no one. Why? And here's the dilemma. Is it because I chose God? We chose God? Or is it because God chose us? And what about those other ones? Did they make a bad choice? And for me, it raises more questions. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to introduce John Knox. We have 5 more minutes? Mm-hmm. Okay. You know the face? Mm-hmm. Rick Steves?
Yep.
I didn't choose him because he's from Minnesota and he's a Lutheran. Seriously. I chose him because this is St. Giles Church in Edinburgh. You'll see the exterior and the interior. You'll see a Scots is the right word, a Scots, these are my people, docent inside the church. And I worshiped here for a year, about half of the time, just because of the majesty of the building and the history. This is where John Knox preached. And I spent a year at the Divinity School at the University of Edinburgh on a grant, doing Aquinas for fun with my dissertation director and 5 other people working in church history. And the other church I went to was a very socialist, very socially active in terms of outreach. So I had the best of what a church can be. So this runs for about 3 minutes, and it'll introduce you. Think of Knox from the pulpit here. And let me tell you another thing, you miserable sinners. The statue at New College has him on a pedestal about 12 foot high. And he's holding a book in one hand, and his other hand is like this. And I'm gonna make another point, I'm not through yet. And he was not, that was only one side of him, much like Luther. But here we go for the introduction to next week.
St. Giles Cathedral is Scotland's most important church. While its ornate spire is designed to look like the crown of thorns, most locals also see in it the Scottish crown. The church was ground zero as Scotland debated whether to stick with the Roman Catholic Church or break away with the Protestant movement. Look into the eyes of John Knox's statue and think of the Reformation struggles of the 16th century. Knox, the great reformer and founder of austere Scottish Presbyterianism, first preached here in 1559. Knox's insistence that every person be able to read the Word of God gave Scotland an education system centuries ahead of the rest of Europe. Thanks partly to Knox, it was Scottish minds that led the way in math, science, engineering, and medicine. Voltaire called Scotland the intellectual capital of Europe. Cathedral guides are stationed around the church, ready to answer your questions.
When Knox took over as minister of this church following the Reformation, he whitewashed the interior. He broke the stained glass. He emphasised the pulpit. The Word of God preached to the congregation was the most important fundamental part of his religion. Knox's theology, of course, led to the Protestant work ethic, that wonderful combination of education, hard work and thrift, because after all, we Scots are very thrifty.
You're famous for that, aren't you? Yeah.
Oh, very much so. We do suffer from short arms and deep pockets.
This neo-Gothic chapel, also from the Victorian age, is the private chapel of the Knights of the Thistle. It's used about once a year when Scotland bestows knighthood on one of its leading citizens. The Queen presides over the ritual from her ornate stall, marked by her Scottish coat of arms, a heraldic zoo of symbolism. Are there bagpipes in heaven? Apparently, yes. Excuse me, sir, do you know where John Knox is buried?
Yes.
By the way, John Knox, Scotland's great reformer, is buried just out back, with appropriate austerity.
Buried under this little. I think it's either
23 or 22.
it's one of these.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's right under there. Little plaque, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, and thanks for indulging me, because these are my memories and they're very important. And next week, we'll go through John Knox, who was much more directly involved in controversy. He was imprisoned and chained into a French galley. Wars between the English and French against the Scottish, and then an alliance between Scotland and France against the English that to this day persists. Just politics, controversy, murder, hangings, and then burning at the stake after being hanged. Just incredible liveliness. So we'll begin with that, and then we'll move on to talk about the Catholic. It's called the Counter-Reformation, and that's kind of a misnomer because there was reform within the Catholic Church. They also wanted to change doctrine so they didn't lose more people to the Protestant, I'll call it a revolution here. But it had some good things in it too. And then we'll find out how we got all of the denominations that we have. Anyone want to take a guess when you go to the book of denominations, how many Protestant, specifically separate groups there are? I'll just name numbers and raise your hand when you think we've hit it. 50? 100? 150? 200?
The last time I looked, it was like 800 and something.
Wow.
Because they had added all of the independent churches that had started spinning off.
Okay. The standard book, when I taught this back in the late 90s at the seminary for 2 years, was it was over 200 at the time. But that was a long time ago. And the independent churches, yes. Yeah. And there are reasons behind that. And it'll explain why we have the Presbyterian and the Lutherans. And they're trying to get together. If you didn't know this, I'll end. The Lutheran School of Theology in Hyde Park at 55th between Woodlawn and University and 1 block west is where I went. McCormick Seminary didn't have a classroom building, so they had staggered classes. I took courses from ethics and preaching from McCormick professors and pastoral care. McCormick built a wing on the back of the property, so it's now a rectangle, and they have all of their administrative offices there. So I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but there will be a time when the Presbyterians and Lutherans will become one church. I mean, they're working on this, and the differences are not that great. If I were younger and wanted to go back into parish ministry, I could easily go to the United Church of Christ, the Episcopalian Church, or the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah.
Not the Methodist yet, because they haven't resolved gender issues and they're going to split. But we used to have just pulpit exchange. Now it's a matter of just getting your records sent over and saying, I would like to pastor in this denomination. And if you're approved, that's it.
Well,
Exchange.
we even have United churches that are combinations of those three throughout the US. Even like First United over in Oak Park is.
Presbyterian and UCC.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks to those of you who are online. Next week, I'm subbing for a friend who has COVID, and I'll be preaching at Edgewater Presbyterian for Communion Sunday. So it'll be on Zoom, but I hope you are here so you can enjoy each other's company. And thanks to those of you on Zoom very much.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.